Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Nice being with you this evening. You know, Yiddish reflects so much of the experience of Eastern European Jews, and many of our families originally came from Eastern Europe and were shaped by Yiddish language and culture. Some Yiddish culture is religious in nature, and some Yiddish culture reflects very secular ideas and a secular version of Judaism. Even many of the Yiddishists were very antagonistic to religion. And the Yiddish writers such as Shalom Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Shalom Asch, to name a few, were literary geniuses, and thank goodness so much of the material is translated into English, and even though I'm sure a lot is lost in translation, you still can get a sense of the beauty and genius and insight of this Yiddish literature and culture. In the process of becoming Americans, unfortunately, that culture has greatly been lost. Nevertheless, some Yiddish words are part of American Jewish culture, and we throw some Yiddish words into our discourse because they are so expressive. And even though my grandparents were totally both fluent in Yiddish, and my grandfather was a translator, he was an attorney, a translator for Yiddish-speaking people who needed to be represented in court. He did that as a young lawyer. But I very rarely used Yiddish, except there were some Yiddish words that were thrown in. So I want to give you Yiddish lesson number 1 at the New Reform Temple tonight. And I want to start with a fundamental Yiddish word. It's called kvetch. And I've done some research about it. Kvetchen, which literally means to squeeze or pinch. The verb is kvetch. The third person singular simple present is kvetches. The present participle is kvetching. The simple past and past participle is kvetched. The noun is kvetch, plural kvetches. And the definition is a person who endlessly whines or complains, a person who finds fault with anything. Number 2, an instance of kvetching, a complaint or a whine. Now, words have meaning outside of just a dictionary definition. Words have a meaning in the context of a culture, and there was a writer in the Jewish newspaper in Boston named Corinne Engber who wrote an extensive article on this, but the line I really liked, what she said was, she defined kvetching as a time-honored tradition of the Jewish people. Now, our Torah portion, I could rename it the Parsha Kvetching, because in so many different ways it proves this Jewish connection with kvetching. Let me give you some examples. It begins with Moses. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them. Greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, "Was it for want of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us? Take us out of Egypt." A little bit of kvetch. And then God says to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me?" The commentators, starting with Rashi, says that when it says the Hebrew there means praying. But when you read the simple meaning of the Hebrew, and I don't have a PhD in Hebrew grammar, but it's pretty clear, it's basically saying Moses is complaining. So God is basically saying to him, stop kvetching. Stop complaining. Tell the Israelites to go forward. That, it seems to me that God is saying, I've heard your complaints. And then we read the story of the parting of the Sea of Reeds. But the complaining appears to stop for a moment. There's a reprieve. It says, when the Israel saw the wondrous power which the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They had faith in the Lord and his servant Moses. But the rabbis knew that the complaining wasn't over. The splitting of the Sea of Reeds, according to Jewish tradition, is the greatest miracle ever performed. And yet, we are told in one rabbinic tradition, one midrash, that mentions two Israelites, Reuven and Shimon, who had a very different experience. Apparently, the bottom of the sea, though safe to walk on, was not completely dry, but a little muddy, like a beach at low tide. Reuven stepped into it and curled his lips. What is this muck? Shimon scowled. There's mud over every place. This is just like the slime pits of Egypt, replied Reuven. What's the difference, complained Shimon? Mud here, mud there, it's all the same. And so it went for these two of them, grumbling all the way across the bottom of the sea to freedom. And because they never once looked up, they never understood why in the distant shore, everyone was singing and dancing. And for Reuven and Shimon, the miracle never happened. They kvetched. Okay, the Israelites are on their journey. And then we read there, they complained about the food and the drink. They didn't like how God catered the journey. And the Torah says the people set out on their journey. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And then he provides water. And then the Israelites grumble again. They say it would have been better to die in Egypt, where we had good food, which was a delusion. And now we are in the wilderness to starve. And then we read that God provides manna and then quail, so they will be satiated. Now, the story is more descriptive than that, but the point is clear. They are a nation of kvetchers. God responds to the Israelites' astonishing, ungrateful kvetching with the counter kvetch. I heard you, I will address your needs. But God never tells them to completely give up kvetching. There is no mitzvah, thou shalt not kvetch. So when you look at some preachers, and I decided to kind of look up what non-Jewish preachers say about how they preach this, okay? And it's not that difficult. Just Google, I don't know, this passage, sermon, and some Christian. No, they're very some. I read a couple of them, and there is one theme that goes through all of them. Kvetching is bad. What right do the Israelites have to be such complainers? We have an extremely benevolent God, a God who's taken us out of Egypt after 430 years of slavery, a God who saves the Israelites from obliteration at the Sea of Reeds, a God who feeds them. How ungrateful they are. And then the preachers pivot and they proclaim we should be more appreciative in our own lives. Stop complaining, be grateful. That's the road to a happy life. Of course, gratefulness is essential to a good life. We have much to be thankful for, and we should express it, and I've spoken about that many times, because clearly thankfulness is an appropriate Jewish response. But I want to suggest that kvetching is often a good thing, a very good thing. First, it is certainly good when it comes to the Israelites. Now think about this. An enslaved people cannot complain. They must endure suffering quietly. Complaints are dangerous. What is the first step of freedom? Being able to speak out. Being able to say what's on your mind. Without fear of repercussions, speak out against the Ukrainian war, you're arrested in Russia. That's not the Jewish view. Kvetching is about saying, I am a person who sees the world the way I do. and I'm going to tell you what I think, and I'm not going to hold back. That is what freedom is. Kvetching is healing and empowering. The biblical kvetching is group therapy. Healthy people express their good feelings and their negative feelings. Kvetching creates community. We focus together on what's wrong. It's like what happens at the Oneg Shabbat. We start talking to each other. We take sides. We get excited. We challenge each other. And we develop a sense of commonality and fellowship, which is wonderful. That certainly was the American Civil Rights Movement, wasn't it? Oppression, which led to protest, which led to a lot of infighting, that led to community action, to collective purpose. The world as it is not right. We're going to speak up, even if it makes other people angry. The prophets were kvetchers. They saw the world as it was, and they complained that it's not the world that they can accept. And even when they didn't have the influence that they wished to motivate others to change the world, they spoke out, because that was a form of power. Kvetching is to the Jewish soul what breathing is to the Jewish body. For Jews, kvetching is a way for us to understand the world. In Jewish history, when the Jews experienced a world that was against them, or dangerous, or they felt powerless, kvetching was a way of inspiration. That's its link to Yiddish. An Eastern European group who didn't have a lot of power often, who lived often in poverty, in oppression. But kvetching gave them power. We can't change the world at one moment, but we certainly can complain about it, and it gives us hope and strength. What does it have to do with us today? You know, one of the outstanding Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, inspirational not just to Jews and Christians, was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he wrote many important books, some in Yiddish, in fact. But he wrote two important books about religion in English. One was God in Search of Man, a philosophy of Judaism. But he also wrote a book that people don't read as much called Man is Not Alone, a philosophy of religion. And this is an old copy of this that I have that cost when it was new, cost $2.95. That shows how old it is. And Heschel, he was the most poetic, the wisest, most thoughtful philosopher, leader, and he was someone who was like this with Martin Luther King. He has this section called The Endless Discontent. And I stumbled on this. And this is what he says. He says, the aim of Jewish piety lies not in futile efforts towards satisfaction of needs in which one chances to indulge and which cannot otherwise be fulfilled, but in the maintenance and fanning of a discontent with our aspirations and achievements, in the maintenance and fanning of a craving that knows no satisfaction. Judaism teaches man never to be pleased, to despise satisfaction, to crave for the utmost, to appreciate objectives to which he is usually indifferent. It plants in him a seed of endless yearning, a need of spiritual needs rather than a need of achievements, teaching him to be content with what he has, but never with what he is. Then he's got a real punch, he says. It is because of men's dissatisfaction with the customs, sanctions, and modes of behavior of their age and race that moral progress is possible. New insights begin with when satisfaction comes to an end, when all that has been seen or said looks like a distortion to him who sees the world for the first time. And then his last paragraph I will share with you, he talks about the prophets of ancient Israel. He says, If we should try to portray the soul of a prophet by the emotion that had no place in it, contentment would be mentioned first. The prophets, this sentence is worth the price of admission. The prophets of Israel were like geysers of disgust, disturbing our conscience to this day, urging us to be heartsick for the hurts of others. Kvetching is a really serious business. Shabbat shalom.